Kalispell, Montana, June 15, 1974. The newsroom of the Kalispell Daily Chronicle buzzed with the familiar symphony of typewriter keys and ringing phones. Margaret Maggie Blaine adjusted the collar of her cream-colored blouse and tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear as she reviewed her notes one final time. At 26, she had already earned a reputation as the most tenacious reporter in northwestern Montana, the kind who wouldn't let a story go until every question had an answer. The manila folder on her desk contained weeks of careful investigation into rumors that had been circulating through the small mountain communities surrounding Libby, whispers of illegal dumping, of mining companies cutting corners, of documents that disappeared as quickly as they surfaced. The kind of story that made local officials uncomfortable and powerful men nervous. "You sure about this one, Maggie?" asked Tom Riverside, the Chronicle's editor, peering over his wire-rimmed glasses. The afternoon light streaming through the newsroom windows cast long shadows across his weathered face. "Some of these mining folks don't appreciate questions." Maggie's green eyes sparkled with determination. "That's exactly why someone needs to ask them, Tom." She gathered her camera, notebook, and car keys. "Calvin Monroe agreed to meet me up near the lake. Says he has information about the Libby mining operation that I'll want to hear." The drive north along Highway 93 took Maggie through some of Montana's most breathtaking scenery. Towering pines lined the winding road, their shadows dancing across her windshield as the late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy. She rolled down the windows of her blue Chevrolet Nova, breathing in the crisp mountain air tinged with the scent of pine needles and distant wood smoke. Radio static crackled through her car speakers as she tuned between stations, finally settling on a folk song that seemed to match the rhythm of her tires on the asphalt. The familiar melody of Big Yellow Taxi by Joni Mitchell filled the car as she hummed along, her mind already focused on the questions she planned to ask Monroe. She had spoken with Calvin Monroe only twice before, once by phone to arrange this meeting, and briefly at a town hall meeting where he'd sat in the back row, his weathered hands folded in his lap, saying nothing. He was a man of few words, but those who knew him described him as someone who understood the mountains and the mining business better than most. As the road curved around the southern edge of Flathead Lake, Maggie caught her first glimpse of the vast expanse of water that locals called the crown jewel of Montana. The lake stretched out like a mirror, reflecting the clouds and the surrounding peaks in perfect clarity. Somewhere out there, Monroe had said he would explain what the Libby Mining Company had really been doing in the remote areas near the Canadian border. Her notes contained fragments of a larger puzzle. Dates when trucks had been seen on logging roads that led to nowhere, testimony from a former employee who claimed to have seen things that shouldn't have been buried, and financial records that suggested the company had been spending money on disposal operations that didn't appear in any official reports. At 4:30 p.m., Maggie parked her Nova on a dirt access road that led down to a secluded cove on the lake's eastern shore. The engine ticked as it cooled, and she could hear the gentle lapping of waves against the rocky shoreline below. She grabbed her camera and notebook, checked her watch, and began walking down the narrow trail toward the water. The last person to see Maggie Blaine alive was a park ranger who waved to her from his boat as she stood on the shore, camera in hand, apparently waiting for someone who would change everything. Kalispell, Montana, June 18, 1974. 3 days had passed since anyone had heard from Maggie Blaine, and the newsroom that once hummed with her energy now felt hollow. Tom Riverside paced behind his desk, his coffee growing cold as he stared at the phone, willing it to ring with news. "She's never missed a deadline," he muttered to himself, running his fingers through his thinning grey hair. "So not once in 4 years." The search had begun unofficially when Maggie failed to return to her apartment Sunday night. Her landlady, Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, had called the Chronicle Monday morning after finding Maggie's weekend mail still uncollected and her cat crying at the door. By Tuesday, the Flathead County Sheriff's Department had organized a formal search operation. Sheriff Robert Hayes stood beside Maggie's abandoned Nova, his breath visible in the crisp morning air, as he surveyed the scene. The car sat exactly where the park ranger had seen it 3 days earlier, driver's door unlocked, keys still dangling from the ignition. The radio played softly, tuned to the same folk station Maggie had been listening to on her drive north. "Your vehicle shows no signs of struggle," Deputy Michael Owens noted, his pen scratching across his incident report. "Personal effects appear undisturbed. Purse on the passenger seat contains wallet, identification, and approximately $37 in cash. What troubled the investigators most was what they found in the car. Maggie's camera bag sat on the back seat, but the camera itself was missing. Her notebook lay open on the dashboard, pages fluttering in the mountain breeze, filled with her careful handwriting about mining operations and environmental concerns. The last entry, dated June 15th, simply read, C.M., 4:30 p.m., Lake Access Road. Search teams combed the shoreline for hours, their voices echoing across the water as they called Maggie's name. Volunteers from Kalispell joined law enforcement officers, farmers and loggers in a grid search that extended from the lakeshore up into the surrounding forest. The dense undergrowth and steep terrain made progress slow and treacherous. Calvin Monroe appeared at the sheriff's station Tuesday afternoon, his work boots still muddy from the construction site where he supervised mining equipment. He removed his hard hat as he spoke with Sheriff Hayes, his voice steady but his hands fidgeting with the brim. "I was supposed to meet with that reporter girl," Monroe explained, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Got called away for an emergency at the Libby site, engine trouble on one of the big excavators. By the time I got to the lake, maybe 6 o'clock, she was already gone." Monroe's alibi checked out. The Libby Mining Company's maintenance logs showed an equipment failure that afternoon, and 2 other workers confirmed Monroe had been at the remote site, dealing with mechanical problems until well after dark. As days turned into weeks, the search expanded and then gradually contracted. The initial urgency gave way to the grinding routine of a missing person investigation. Sheriff Hayes interviewed dozens of people who had known Maggie, from her college roommate in Missoula to the waitress at Murphy's Diner, who served her coffee every morning. Maggie was passionate about her work, said her friend Sarah Collins, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue as she sat in the sheriff's office. She believed journalism could make a difference, especially in small towns where powerful people think no one's watching. The investigation revealed the extent of Maggie's research into the Libby Mining Company. Her editor, Tom Riverside, turned over boxes of notes, photographs, and interview transcripts that painted a picture of a reporter who had been methodically building a case about environmental violations in the remote mining operations near the Canadian border. She was careful, Tom told investigators. Never published anything she couldn't prove, but she was convinced something illegal was happening up there, and she was determined to expose it. Weeks stretched into months. Maggie's parents, Frank and Dorothy Blaine, drove up from Billings every weekend to distribute missing person flyers and check with local businesses. Her father, a retired railroad worker with calloused hands and patient eyes, would spend hours walking the same forest trails that search teams had already covered. "She's my only child," Frank told a local television reporter during a brief interview outside the sheriff's station. "Whatever happened to her, someone knows something, and we're not giving up until we find out what that is." By autumn of 1974, the active search had largely ended. Maggie's disappearance remained an open case, but with no new leads and no physical evidence beyond her abandoned car, the investigation had reached an apparent dead end. The last official entry in the case file, dated October 15, 1974, noted that all available resources had been exhausted and that the case would remain open pending the discovery of new evidence. For the next 50 years, that evidence would remain hidden beneath the cold, dark waters of Flathead Lake. Flathead Lake, Montana, May 12, 2025. The morning mist hung low over Flathead Lake as Jake Morrison cast his line into the dark water, the surface barely disturbed by the gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine and distant snow. At 62, Jake had been fishing these waters for most of his life, but something felt different about this particular Monday morning in May. Jake had retired from his job at the Kalispell lumber mill 3 years earlier, and fishing had become his meditation, his escape from the arthritis that had settled into his joints, and the loneliness that had followed him since his wife Ellen's passing. He knew every cove, every underwater ledge, every spot where the lake trout liked to hide. His aluminum boat drifted slowly near the eastern shore, not far from where a forgotten dirt road led down to what locals still called Reporter's Cove, a name that had stuck in the decades since a young journalist had vanished there in 1974. Jake had been just 12 years old when Maggie Blaine disappeared, but he remembered the search helicopters and the crowds of volunteers that had swarmed the area that summer. As his fishing line settled into the deeper water, Jake felt the familiar tension that meant he'd found the right depth. He opened his thermos of coffee, the steam rising in the cool morning air, and settled in to wait. The mountains surrounding the lake stood like silent sentinels, their peaks still capped with snow despite the approaching summer. 20 minutes passed before Jake felt his rod bend with unusual weight. At first, he assumed he'd hooked a large fish, but as he began to reel in the line, the resistance felt wrong. Too steady, too heavy, like he was pulling up a piece of the lake bottom itself. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, bracing himself against the boat's gunwale as he worked the reel. Whatever he'd caught wasn't fighting like a fish. It came up slowly, steadily, like a waterlogged tree branch or a piece of old fishing equipment. When the object finally broke the surface, Jake's breath caught in his throat. Dripping with lake water and covered in 50 years of sediment was a metal tackle box, the kind that fishermen used to store their gear in the 1970s. The box was secured with several layers of what looked like electrical tape, now blackened and partially dissolved, but still holding the container shut. Jake carefully pulled the box into his boat, water streaming from its rusted edges onto the aluminum floor. The metal was pitted with corrosion, but he could make out the faded remnants of what might have been a brand name on the lid. His hands trembled slightly as he examined his find, a strange mixture of excitement and unease settling in his stomach. Back at the boat launch, Jake loaded his gear with unusual haste. The tackle box sat on his passenger seat as he drove home, its presence somehow ominous in the confined space of his pickup truck. He'd found plenty of unusual items in the lake over the years: old bottles, pieces of lumber, even a motorcycle that someone had dumped decades earlier. But this felt different. In his garage, Jake spread newspapers across his workbench and carefully placed the tackle box under the light of his desk lamp. The electrical tape peeled away reluctantly, leaving sticky residue on his fingers. When he finally lifted the lid, the hinges protested with a metallic squeal that seemed too loud in the quiet space. Inside, wrapped in what had once been a clear plastic bag, were several items that made Jake's heart race. A woman's watch with a delicate silver band, its face stopped at 6:23. A pair of small earrings, silver with what looked like tiny turquoise stones. A class ring from the University of Montana, dated 1970. But it was the other items that made Jake reach for his phone with shaking hands. A driver's license, the plastic warped and discolored but still readable: Margaret A. Blaine, DOB 04-15-1948. And beneath that, a Polaroid photograph showing two figures standing near the edge of a lake at dusk, their faces indistinct, but one clearly wearing what looked like the same cream-colored blouse described in old newspaper articles. Jake had read those articles many times over the years. Every anniversary of Maggie's disappearance, the local paper would run a brief update, hoping someone might come forward with information. He knew that Sheriff Hayes had retired long ago, but he also knew that his granddaughter Dana now worked for the Flathead County Sheriff's Department. The call to the non-emergency line connected Jake to Deputy Sarah Chen, who listened patiently as he described his discovery. Within an hour, Jake's garage had become a crime scene, complete with yellow tape and a forensics team from Missoula. Officer Dana Greeley arrived at Jake's house as the evidence team was photographing the contents of the tackle box. At 34, Dana had inherited her grandfather's methodical approach to police work and his stubborn refusal to let cold cases stay cold. She knelt beside the workbench, studying the items that had emerged from 50 years beneath the lake. "My grandfather worked this case when I was a kid," Dana told the lead forensics technician. "He always said Maggie Blaine was the one case he couldn't solve, the one that kept him awake at night." The photograph was carefully removed from its plastic wrapping and placed under a magnifying lamp. In the fading light captured by the Polaroid, two figures stood at the water's edge. One was clearly a woman with shoulder-length hair, wearing what appeared to be a light-colored blouse. The other figure was larger, masculine, wearing dark clothing and standing slightly behind the woman. "Can we enhance this?" Dana asked. "We can try," replied the technician, "but 50 years underwater, we'll be lucky if we can make out much more detail than this." As the evidence team worked, Dana felt the weight of her grandfather's legacy settling on her shoulders. Harold Greeley had died 3 years earlier, taking with him decades of knowledge about cases that had shaped his career. The Maggie Blaine investigation had been one of his greatest frustrations, a puzzle missing too many pieces to ever be complete. Now, half a century later, those pieces had finally begun to surface from the depths of Flathead Lake. Dana looked out through Jake Morrison's garage door toward the distant mountains, where the answers to her grandfather's questions had been waiting all along, patient as the stones at the bottom of the lake. Kalispell, Montana, May 20th, 2025. The fluorescent lights in the Flathead County Sheriff's Department evidence room hummed softly as Officer Dana Greeley spread the contents of the tackle box across a metal examination table. 8 days had passed since Jake Morrison's discovery, and the forensics lab in Missoula had worked overtime to extract every possible piece of information from the items that had spent 50 years beneath the lake. DNA analysis had been successful beyond Dana's expectations. Despite decades of submersion, genetic material recovered from the inside of Maggie's class ring had provided a partial profile that matched samples from the journalist's hairbrush, still preserved in the evidence locker from 1974. More significantly, additional DNA traces found inside the tackle box belonged to someone else entirely. Sheriff Patricia Coleman, who had taken over the department 5 years earlier, reviewed the lab results with Dana. "The unknown DNA profile shows up in the state database," she said, sliding a printout across the desk. "Calvin Monroe, arrested for drunk and disorderly in 1987. Fingerprints and DNA were collected as part of the booking process." Dana studied the file photograph of Monroe taken during his arrest. At 55 Chas, he had been a large man with weathered features and the thick hands of someone who had spent his life working with heavy machinery. Now 82 and suffering from early-stage dementia, he lived at Whitefish Care Center, 30 miles north of Kalispell. The drive to the care facility took Dana through the same landscape that Maggie Blaine had traveled on her final day. Highway 93 wound through valleys, where morning frost still clung to the grass despite the late spring warmth. Dana's grandfather had driven this same route countless times during the original investigation, always hoping that one more interview, one more search, might yield the breakthrough that would bring Maggie home. Calvin Monroe sat in a wheelchair by the window of the care center's common room, his eyes focused somewhere beyond the glass, where a small garden bloomed with early summer flowers. Dana approached slowly, showing her badge to the attending nurse before taking a seat across from the elderly man. "Mr. Monroe, I'm Officer Greeley with the Flathead County Sheriff's Department. I'd like to ask you a few questions about something that happened a long time ago." Monroe's eyes shifted to Dana's face, showing a flicker of awareness that came and went, like clouds passing over the sun. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper. "Questions about what?" Dana opened her folder and carefully placed a photograph on the table between them. Not the water-damaged Polaroid from the tackle box, but a newspaper photo of Maggie Blaine from 1974, smiling at the camera with the confidence of someone who believed the truth was always worth pursuing. Monroe stared at the photograph for a long moment, his fingers gripping the arms of his wheelchair. "I remember her," he said finally. "The reporter girl. She was asking questions about the mining company." "What kind of questions, Mr. Monroe?" The elderly man's gaze drifted back to the window, and for several minutes Dana wondered if he had forgotten she was there. Then, without warning, he began to speak in a voice that carried the weight of 50 years of secrets. "She found out about the dumping," Monroe said. "Chemical waste from the processing plant. We were supposed to truck it to a proper facility in Spokane, but that cost money, lot of money. So we took shortcuts." Dana's pen moved steadily across her notepad as Monroe continued, his words coming in fragments that painted a picture of corporate negligence and environmental crime that would have made front-page news in 1974. "The company told us to bury it up in the remote areas, places where nobody would ever look. Said it was just industrial sludge, nothing dangerous, but I knew better. I'd seen what that stuff could do to the machinery, how it ate through metal like acid." Monroe described a systematic pattern of illegal dumping that had gone on for years, with trucks carrying barrels of toxic waste to remote mountain locations where they were buried in unmarked graves. The financial records that Maggie had been investigating told only part of the story. The real evidence lay hidden in the mountains, slowly leaching into groundwater and streams. "She was supposed to meet me at the lake," Monroe continued, his voice growing stronger as the memories became clearer. "I was going to tell her where the dump sites were located, give her the maps, the dates, everything she needed to prove what we'd been doing." Dana leaned forward. "But you didn't meet her that day." Monroe's eyes filled with tears, the first real emotion he had shown during the interview. "I went to the lake, but not to help her. The company found out about our meeting. My supervisor, Tom Bradley, he said if I talked to that reporter, I'd lose my job, my pension, everything. Said they'd make sure I never worked in mining again." The confession that followed came in broken pieces, each one harder to speak than the last. Monroe described arriving at the lake to find Maggie waiting by the water, camera in hand, ready to document whatever evidence he might provide. Instead of information, he brought threats and intimidation. I told her to forget what she'd heard, to drop the story, but she wouldn't listen. Said people had a right to know what we were doing to their land, their water. Monroe's voice cracked. Then she started taking pictures of me, said she was going to write about companies that threatened journalists. According to Monroe's account, the confrontation escalated quickly. Maggie refused to hand over her camera or her notes. In the struggle that followed, she fell and struck her head on the rocky shoreline. Monroe insisted it was an accident, but his actions afterward suggested he knew the implications of what had happened. She wasn't moving, Monroe whispered. I checked for a pulse, tried to wake her up, but she was gone. I panicked. If they found her body there, and if she had those notes about the dumping? Monroe described wrapping Maggie's body in a tarp from his truck and weighing it down with chains before sinking it in the deeper part of the lake. Her camera and personal belongings went into the tackle box, which he had intended to dispose of far from shore, but dropped in his haste to leave the scene. Dana's investigation over the following weeks corroborated key elements of Monroe's confession. Company records from the Libby mining operation, stored in a warehouse in Spokane, contained internal memos discussing waste disposal irregularities and concerns about regulatory oversight. Environmental testing in areas Monroe identified revealed contamination consistent with his description of the illegal dumping. Most significantly, sonar imaging of Flathead Lake located what appeared to be human remains in 180 feet of water, weighted down with chains in exactly the location Monroe had described. The recovery operation, conducted by state police divers, would take months to complete, but preliminary examination confirmed that the remains were consistent with a young woman who had died in the mid-1970s. Calvin Monroe died of a heart attack 6 weeks after his confession, taking with him the names of company officials who had ordered the cover-up and the exact locations of dozens of illegal dump sites scattered throughout northwestern Montana. His death came 2 days before he was scheduled to provide a formal statement to prosecutors who were considering criminal charges related to both Maggie's death and the environmental crimes. On a cold morning in November 2025, Margaret Blaine was finally laid to rest in Sunset Memorial Cemetery in Kalispell, her casket surrounded by flowers and attended by dozens of people who had never met her but understood the importance of her sacrifice. Her parents had both died years earlier, but the community that had searched for her in 1974 came together once more to honor the young woman who had died seeking the truth. Tom Riverside, now 96 and confined to a wheelchair, spoke at the service with a voice that still carried the authority of his decades in journalism. Maggie believed that in a democracy, people have the right to know when those in power break the law, he said, his words carrying across the cemetery where autumn leaves fell like memories. And she died because she wouldn't be silenced, because she understood that some stories are worth the risk. The environmental cleanup of the illegal dump sites would continue for years, funded by a legal settlement with the mining company's successor corporation. But for Dana Greeley, standing beside her grandfather's grave after the service, the case represented something more than justice delayed. She's been waiting 50 years for someone to tell her story, Dana said to her husband as they walked back to their car. Now, maybe she can rest. Behind them, Flathead Lake stretched into the distance, its surface reflecting the gray November sky like a mirror that had finally given up its secrets. In the depths where Maggie Blaine had waited for half a century, fish swam through the growing darkness, their movements rippling outward toward shores where the truth had finally found its way home.